Cheyenne Bend, North Dakota, August 1952. The air was thick with the scent of cut alfalfa and the drone of late summer insects. On the flat expanse of prairie, under a sky too big for the land, Janice Ozelinch was engaged in a struggle that made no sense to anyone watching. He had his small, 20-foot Quonset hut, the half-cylinder of corrugated steel that served as his family's home. Now, with a system of jacks, levers, and sheer stubborn will, he was trying to slide a second, much larger 40-foot Quonset directly over the top of it. The larger arch, purchased from Royden Tackberry's war surplus yard in Fargo, looked like a silver whale trying to swallow a minnow. It scraped and groaned, resisting every inch of progress. From the dusty road, a pickup truck slowed and stopped. Royden Tackberry himself leaned out the window, his face a mask of professional disbelief. With him were Jedediah Coombs and Silas Grant, two farmers on their way back from the grain elevator. "Ozelinch!" Tackberry shouted over the whine of the wind. "What in God's name are you doing? I sold you that arch for a machine shed, not a hat for your house." Janice paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He said nothing. Tackberry got out of the truck, slamming the door. He was a man who understood steel, its strengths, its limits, its profound inability to hold warmth. You're creating a 3-foot gap between those walls. Come the first hard frost, every bit of warm air from your stove is going to hit that cold outer shell and weep moisture. It'll rain inside your walls. It'll rust both of those arches to lace in 2 winters. You're building a swamp, man, a steel swamp. He turned to the others. It's the damnedest foolishness I've ever seen. He's going to ruin my reputation. People will think I sell junk steel that sweats. Jedediah Coombs just shook his head, muttering to Silas, "Plain crazy. The man's gone prairie mad." Janice looked at the massive steel arch, then at the concerned, mocking faces of his neighbors. He picked up his pry bar. "I need more chaff," he said, more to himself than to them, and went back to work. What did this quiet Latvian, a builder of strange threshing barns from a world away, understand about radiant containment that a dealer of war surplus steel, a man who lived and breathed the stuff, had missed? Before we witness the verdict delivered by a Dakota polar outbreak, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We explore the forgotten wisdom of those who survived on the edge of possibility. I promise, by the end of this story, you will understand the profound physics of heat in a way that just might change how you look at your own 4 walls. Have you ever lived in a place that was impossible to keep warm? Tell us about it in the comments below. Janice Ozelinch was not a carpenter, not a farmer, and not a frontiersman in the way North Dakota understood the terms. He was a displaced person, a man who had walked out of the ruins of Eastern Europe with his wife Ilse and their 2 young children, Peterus and Laga. They carried little more than a memory of a world that no longer existed. In that world, on the shores of the Baltic, Janice had been a builder of reges. These were not simple barns. A regia was a complex twin-shelled structure, a building within a building, designed for the slow, gentle drying of harvested grain using a central, low-heat kiln. His hands knew the language of radiant warmth, of contained heat, of the careful management of air and moisture. He had worked with heavy timbers, clay-lined fire pits, and the precise spacing of inner and outer roof lines to create a perfect drying environment, safe from the damp sea air. When he arrived in North Dakota in 1951, sponsored by a Lutheran relief agency, that knowledge seemed useless. Here, everything was built of dimensional lumber and, increasingly, of cheap war surplus steel. He bought his 20-foot Quonset from Tackberry for $150 and set it on a concrete slab. It was a home, of a sort. Then came their first winter. That winter was a lesson in a kind of cold Janice had never known. It wasn't the damp chill of the Baltics. It was a dry, predatory cold that seemed to suck the life out of matter itself. The single layer of corrugated steel offered no more defense than a cotton sheet. The misery was not abstract. It was measured in a litany of small, daily defeats. When Janice sat down to write a letter to a cousin he hoped was still alive in Germany, the ink in the bottle seized into a black slush, the pen scratching uselessly on the paper. When Ilse cooked their thin potato soup, a skin of ice would form across the top of the bowl before the spoon could even reach her lips. At night, they slept fully clothed under a pile of every blanket they owned, and in the morning, their exhalations would have frozen on their eyebrows, leaving them white and stiff as if they were ancient men. The cold wasn't just outside, it was inside, a permanent resident of their steel shell, a thief that stole every calorie of heat their small stove could produce. Janice knew his family wouldn't survive another winter like that. He wasn't just building a peculiar house. He was fighting for their lives with the only knowledge he possessed. The failure of the conventional Quonset hut was not a mystery. It was a simple, brutal equation of physics. Royden Tackberry understood this on a practical level, which was why he sold them as sheds, not houses. The problem began with conduction. Steel is a magnificent conductor of temperature. The thin metal ribs that formed the structure of the hut acted as thermal bridges, directly connecting the frigid exterior to the heated interior. With an R value, the measure of thermal resistance, close to zero, the inside surface of the hut was often only a few degrees warmer than the outside air. If it was 20 below zero outside, the wall just inches from your bed was a sheet of metal hovering near the same temperature. Any warmth generated by the stove would rise, hit this frigid ceiling, and the heat would be instantly conducted outside and lost. But a worse phenomenon occurred: condensation. The warm, moist air from breathing, cooking, and living would touch the freezing metal walls and instantly condense, just like breath on a cold window pane. This moisture would run down the curved walls in rivulets, pooling on the floor where it would freeze into slick, dangerous sheets of ice. In many huts, the moisture froze directly onto the walls, building up a thick layer of interior frost that glittered menacingly in the lamplight. Occupants were living inside a giant, poorly designed refrigerator. This led to a vicious cycle. To fight the cold, families burned fuel at a terrifying rate. They would stuff their stoves with wood or coal, trying to overwhelm the constant heat loss. The intense, dry heat would parch the air, causing nosebleeds and cracked skin, while the walls remained ice cold. Silas Grant, Janice's neighbor a half-mile down the road, complained he was burning through a cord of wood every 10 days, and his children still slept in their winter coats. The sheer thermal stress on the metal was also immense. The rapid heating and cooling caused the steel panels to contract and expand, popping and groaning all night. It was this same stress that would, in the depths of the coming winter, cause a weld on Silas's kerosene tank to fail, splitting the metal and spilling his entire winter's supply of fuel onto the frozen ground. The single-skin Quonset hut wasn't a home. It was a trap, a steel coffin waiting for a winter cold enough to seal it. The construction of Janice's double-shelled home began in earnest that August. After securing the 40-foot Quonset from Tackberry, who sold it with a cynical shake of his head, the real work started. The first challenge was immense, moving the larger arch into position. Without a crane, Janice relied on a series of automotive jacks, greased timber runners, and the patient inch-by-inch application of a long pry bar. It took him 3 weeks of grueling labor, with Ilse and even young Peterus helping to reset the blocks and wedges. The sound of groaning, scraping metal became the soundtrack of their days. Once the outer shell was in place, perfectly centered over the smaller one, the next phase began. This was the part that truly baffled observers. Janice fabricated dozens of heavy iron straps. He bolted these to the ribs of the outer arch, letting them hang down into the 3-foot cavity. Then, he painstakingly drilled new holes in the inner arch and hung it from these straps, like a hammock. The inner Quonset was no longer resting on the concrete slab. It was suspended, floating within its larger sibling. When Royden Tackberry saw this, he grew even more agitated. "Now you've got metal touching metal. You're just building a faster road for the cold to travel." Janice simply pointed. "No touch," he said. He had inserted thick leather washers, salvaged from old horse tack, between the straps and the inner shell. There was no direct metal-to-metal contact. He had created a thermal break, a concept most engineers wouldn't formalize for another 30 years. The final and most laborious step was the insulation. Janice went to the grain elevator and bought hundreds of empty burlap sacks for a penny apiece. He then drove his truck to every farm that would let him, shoveling up the discarded piles of oat chaff, the light, fluffy hulls left over from threshing. For weeks, the family's evenings were spent stuffing the sacks. They were packed loosely, not compressed, to create as many tiny air pockets as possible. Then, one by one, Janice hauled them up a ladder and lowered them into the dark 3-foot chasm between the walls. He packed the entire cavity, from the ground up to the apex of the roof, with over 600 sacks of oat chaff. The mockery was relentless. At the elevator, Tackberry held court. "He's building a fire trap inside a rust bucket," he'd proclaim to anyone who would listen. "One spark from that stovepipe and the whole thing will go up like a torch. If it doesn't burn, the chaff will get damp, it'll rot, and the smell will drive them out by spring. Mark my words, that man is wasting his time and my steel." Janice heard the talk. He'd see the farmers point and shake their heads as they drove by. His response was always the same. When Jedediah Coombs asked him directly why he was filling his walls with flammable trash, Janice looked at him calmly. "Air does not move," he said, and returned to his work. Ilse, when asked by another farmer's wife if she wasn't afraid of living in such a strange contraption, simply replied, "Janice knows the ways of heat. In Latvia, this is how we kept the grain from spoiling. It will keep the children from freezing." Her trust was as solid and silent as her husband's work. To understand what Janice Ozelinch had built, you have to understand the 3 ways heat moves: conduction, convection, and radiation. The standard Quonset hut was a masterclass in failing at all 3. Janice's creation was a fortress designed to defeat each one in turn. First, conduction, the transfer of heat through direct contact. In a normal Quonset, the steel ribs were a direct bridge from inside to outside. By suspending the inner shell on straps with leather insulators, Janice had almost completely eliminated this bridge. Heat from the inner living space could not conduct directly through the framework to the outer shell. Second, convection, the transfer of heat through the movement of air or liquid. This was Tackberry's biggest and most logical fear. He envisioned a 3-foot cavity where warm air rising from the inner shell would hit the cold outer shell, cool, and sink, creating a massive continuous convection loop that would efficiently strip heat away. But Tackberry didn't account for the oat chaff sacks. The 600 burlap bags acted as a baffle, completely disrupting this airflow. The air inside the cavity was trapped in millions of tiny pockets within the chaff and between the loosely packed sacks. It could not circulate. Janice was right. The air did not move. This vast 3-foot zone of still air became a powerful insulator. But the real genius was in defeating the third and most powerful form of heat transfer in a Dakota winter: radiation. All objects radiate thermal energy. A hot stove radiates heat that you can feel on your face from across the room. In a standard Quonset, the stove heats the interior air and the inner walls. Those walls then radiate that precious heat energy outward. The single layer of steel radiates it directly to the brutal cold of the exterior. In Janice's design, the physics were entirely different. The small stove only had to heat the small, 20-foot inner hut. As this inner metal skin warmed up to, say, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, it began to radiate heat. But where did that heat go? It radiated into the 3-foot cavity. There, it was absorbed by the sacks of chaff and the trapped air. Over time, this entire buffer zone stabilized at a remarkably mild temperature. It never reached 70 degrees, but it never dropped to freezing either. It hovered in a stable state, a quiet, still, insulated space that Janice's experience told him would be somewhere just above freezing. The inner shell was radiating its heat not against a minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit outer wall, but into a calm, 38-degree environment. The rate of heat loss slowed dramatically. Meanwhile, the outer 40-foot shell was doing its job. It was taking the full force of the wind. It was radiating its own heat out into the black, clear sky. But it was radiating heat from a 38-degree starting point, not a 70-degree one. The brutal temperature differential, the engine of heat loss, was happening across the outer wall, far away from the living space. The inner hut was nestled in the heart of a giant man-made cushion. Janice hadn't just insulated his home. He had decoupled it from the hostile exterior world. He had built a home that only had to fight the gentle climate of its own buffer zone. That November, winter came not as a gradual slide, but as a sudden, brutal assault. A polar outbreak, a vast lobe of Arctic air slid down from Canada and settled over the Dakotas. For 11 consecutive nights, the temperature at the Cheyenne Bend dropped to minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no wind, no snow, just a profound crystalline stillness under a sky littered with stars. This was the most dangerous kind of cold. On clear nights, every object on Earth radiates its heat directly into the black void of space. Roofs, fields, and machinery grew even colder than the surrounding air. It was a cold that leached warmth from everything. For the neighbors in their conventional homes, it was a state of siege. Jedediah Coombs went to his well one morning to find the handle of his pump immovable, the iron mechanism frozen solid. He would have to melt snow for water for a week. The popping and groaning of Silas Grant's Quonset became a sharp shriek one night, followed by the smell of kerosene. He ran outside to find his 200-gallon tank had split right down a welded seam, its precious contents spreading and turning to a useless gel on the frozen earth. Inside their homes, families huddled around stoves burning at full blast, yet the cold was winning. They lived in a small bubble of warmth, 3 feet from the stove, while the rest of their homes were Arctic. Inside the Oslynch home, life continued with an almost defiant normalcy. The contrast was absolute. While Silas Grant was staring at his ruined fuel supply, Janice was using a fraction of the wood. His stovepipe glowed a dull cherry red at its base, but the stove was never roaring. It was fed a steady, slow diet of cottonwood logs. The air inside was warm, but more than that, it was stable. There were no drafts, no cold spots. This was proven not by a thermometer, but by the small details of domestic life. Ilse sat in a chair 10 feet from the stove, mending one of Peterus's shirts. The thread on her needle was supple, not brittle with cold. The steel needle itself was cool, but not painfully so, to the touch. On the floor, a space that in any other prairie home would have been a landscape of frost, Peterus, and Liga, lay on a simple rag rug, reading a picture book from the church. They wore wool sweaters, but not their coats or hats. The butter on the kitchen table, in a covered dish, was soft and spreadable. Janice, checking a small thermometer he had hung on the inner metal wall, noted it read 65 degrees. The wall itself was cool, but it did not radiate cold. It was passive, neutral. They had not defeated the winter outside. They had simply made it irrelevant to the world inside. The polar outbreak could rage. It could split steel tanks and freeze wells. But it could not touch the quiet warmth inside the double-shelled house. The breaking point for Royden Tackberry's skepticism came on the 9th day of the cold snap. He was a decent man beneath his bluster, and he spent the morning helping Silas Grant clean up the mess from the split tank. He agreed to haul the useless, twisted metal to the scrapyard in his flatbed truck. The cold was so intense that the truck's engine was reluctant to turn over, and the chains he used to secure the load were as stiff as iron bars. He was halfway back to Fargo when one of the chains, rattled by the frozen ruts in the road, came loose. He pulled over right in front of Janice Ozelinch's strange, double-humped home. Cursing the cold, Tackberry hopped out of the cab, his bare hands aching instantly in the frigid air. He grabbed the heavy chain and, to get better leverage, leaned his full weight against the outer wall of Janice's Quonset. He braced himself for the searing pain of bare skin on supercooled steel, but the pain never came. What he felt was so unexpected, it stopped him dead. It was not warmth, but it was a profound and shocking lack of cold. The steel was cold, yes, but it felt like metal left in a cool basement, not a piece of steel that had been sitting in minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit air for over a week. He pressed his palm flat against it. He could feel the corrugations, the paint, but not the vicious, heat-sucking bite of extreme cold. He blinked, confused. He walked over to his truck and touched the fender. The pain was immediate, a sharp, burning sensation that made him snatch his hand back. He looked from his truck to the Quonset, his mind struggling to process the contradiction. The steel of his truck was at minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The steel of this outer wall was something else entirely. It was warmer than the cast iron of his own office stove, which had been cold for hours by the time he'd left that morning. Driven by a curiosity that overpowered his pride, he walked to the door and knocked. Janice opened it. A wave of calm, even, dry warmth washed over Tackberry, a warmth utterly alien to the Dakota winter. He stepped inside, and the difference was dizzying. He saw the children on the floor, the soft butter on the table. He saw the stove burning low and steady. "How?" Tackberry asked, his voice rough. "The outside of your wall? It's not frozen." Janice nodded. "Is buffer?" "Show me," Tackberry demanded. Janice led him to a small, insulated hatch he'd built into the inner wall. He opened it, revealing the dark cavity packed with burlap sacks. A faint, earthy smell of oats emerged, but no cold draft. Janice reached inside and pulled out a glass mason jar. It was 3/4 full of kerosene. He handed it to Tackberry. The dealer stared at it. The liquid was perfectly clear, sloshing gently in the jar. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the kerosene in the drums back at his own supply yard was a cloudy, semi-solid slush, so thick with crystallized wax it wouldn't climb a wick. This kerosene was alive. It was pourable. It was ready to burn. This was the proof. This was the undeniable physical fact that shattered his entire understanding of how winter worked. He held the liquid proof in his hands. He looked at Janice, at the quiet confidence in the man's eyes. He wasn't looking at a fool. He was looking at a genius. Tackberry finally understood. "My God, Janice," he said, his voice full of a new and profound respect. "You didn't build a wall. You built a coat." Royden Tackberry's conversion was as total as his skepticism had been loud. He became Janice's most fervent advocate. At the grain elevator, at the general store, at every farm he visited, he told the story of the warm steel and the liquid kerosene. He stopped calling it foolishness and started calling it the Ozelinch system. He described the physics as best he could, explaining the concept of the buffer zone and the trapped air. He was a practical man, and he'd seen practical proof that defied all his experience. His reputation gave the idea immediate credibility. The story eventually reached Arthur Finch, an extension agent for the North Dakota Farm Bureau. Finch was a young man with an engineering degree tasked with helping farmers survive the brutal economics and even more brutal climate of the plains. He drove out to the Cheyenne Bend, listened to Tackberry's story, and then spent 2 hours with Janice, sketching diagrams and taking notes. He understood the principles of the thermal break and radiant containment immediately. Finch returned a week later with a large format camera. He meticulously photographed every aspect of the structure: the suspended inner shell, the leather washers, the packed chaff, the access hatch. That winter, Finch developed a slideshow titled Winter Preparedness: New Solutions for Prairie Living. The centerpiece of the presentation was the Ozzelinch double-shell Quonset. He showed it at town halls and grange meetings across 7 counties from Cass to Richland to Sargent. The images of Janice's children playing on the warm floor next to photos of frost-caked walls in conventional homes were a powerful argument. By the following spring, at least a dozen farmers had bought second-hand Quonsets from Tackberry, not for sheds, but to create their own Dakota double shells. The idea, born of ancient Latvian necessity, was beginning to spread across the frozen prairie. What Janice Ozzelinch had constructed on that flat piece of land was more than just a clever shelter. It was a working prototype of building principles that would be hailed as revolutionary decades later. His handmade leather washers were a crude but effective thermal break, a concept now fundamental to high-efficiency window and building design. The entire structure was a precursor to the super insulation and passive house movements of the late 20th century, which emphasized air tightness and massive levels of insulation to create homes that require minimal heating. The 3-foot cavity, which his neighbors had mocked as wasted space, was in fact the most important room in the house. He had built, without formal training or modern materials, a high-performance home based on an intuitive and ancient understanding of thermodynamics. His region knowledge was not obsolete. It had just been waiting for a problem harsh enough to prove its timeless genius. There is a fundamental difference in how we approach a force like winter. The conventional mind sees it as an enemy to be fought, a wall to be breached. So we build a single, thicker, stronger wall. We push back against the cold with a bigger fire. Our strategy is one of direct opposition, a head-on collision with nature. We believe that if our wall is strong enough, we will win. But the prairie winter is patient, and it always finds a crack. It always bleeds the heat away. Janice Ozzelinch's approach was entirely different. It was not an act of defiance, but an act of profound accommodation. He did not build one wall against winter. He built winter a room to exhaust itself in. The 3-foot space between the shells was a concession, a neutral territory ceded to the cold. Inside that space, the temperature could drop, the wind could howl, and the great battle between the 70-degree warmth of a living home and the minus 34 degrees Fahrenheit fury of a polar night could play out. But the battle was contained. It happened far away from his family. By giving the winter a place to be winter, he had purchased for himself a place to be human. He had created a zone of quiet, letting the storm rage in a room he had built specifically for it, leaving the life within the inner sanctum perfectly, peacefully, undisturbed. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and survival valuable, please like this video and subscribe for more tales of forgotten wisdom. What other examples of old-world knowledge solving modern problems can you think of? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. The information presented in this video is for educational and storytelling purposes, based on historical building practices. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect, though the principles are grounded in real-world examples. Anyone attempting to build or modify a structure should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.